Okay, so part 5 we're going to focus on assumptions. Now that we've got a robust evaporating cloud that defines the entities in a way that are logically defensible and well worded, we can move on to exposing the assumptions that underpin the relationship between the entities in that diagram. How we do that is by using a checklist that helps us validate whether the assumptions that we are making are valid or not. So what is an assumption? It's a statement, conditional belief about why we believe a logical relationship exists. Now, why I've inserted we believe should be obvious from the following statements or notes. And so the first note is that the statement, condition of belief does not need to be factually correct. And we know this is pretty true in our own circumstances, where through a debate we may actually discover that what we thought to be true was in fact invalid. It didn't stop us in the first place from making that assumption, and that's true in general. Secondly, that the assumption needs only to be logically defensible for the person who relies upon it to support his or her point of view. So again, we know that this is true because we can have debates with other people, and people can take a defensive position in terms of their point of view, and we can take the contrary perspective. And what generally underpins those different points of view is in fact the assumptions that only one of those parties has taken. Typically there are one or more assumptions that underpin the relationships between the two entities on an evaporating cloud. And what those assumptions are seeking to do is to define the cause and effect, define why the cause and effect relationship between the two entities connected via an arrow exists. So you'll recall earlier that the entity at the base of the arrow is the cause, and the entity at the head of the arrow is the effect. And of course, in a sequence of logic, you can have cause effect, the effect becomes a cause for another effect, that effect becomes a cause for another effect, and so on. So in relation to the D and D prime, those assumptions are a special case because we're asking why it is that those cannot coexist, as opposed to the other entities in the evaporating cloud where we're seeking to understand why they do exist. In all cases, we're seeking to expose at least 3 assumptions for each arrow, and we should be reminded that exposing assumptions requires us to reserve our judgment. I don't question the legitimacy of the assumption, just the clarity through words. So you can gauge from that that the exercise of exposing assumptions isn't easy. You need to think, and you need to answer the question why the entity relationships exist. And you'll see in the checklist that we're not talking about one entity or another, but indeed the relationship between the two entities. And there are other tests that we use or checklists that we apply to ensure that we're really picking up the ones that matter. And also be mindful of the fact that what you might think to be obvious and therefore don't state the assumption isn't necessarily obvious to others. So you should err on the side of being conservative and state the assumption where possible. So the checklist. These are largely divided into those that apply to the relationships between entities A and B, B and D, AC, A to C and C to D, as opposed to the conflict. But I'll go through these ones first. So the first item on the checklist is to avoid repetition of what is already stated in the entities themselves. So I've used here Entity A, which is maximise returns to the house owner, and Entity B, which is conduct a successful marketing campaign. These two statements are restated as part of the process of discovering an assumption, and the assumption sits behind the word because or after the word because. So to read this out loud, in order to maximise returns to the house owner, I must conduct a successful marketing campaign because, and I've then gone on and said that will maximise the returns to the house owner. So I've stated that as an erroneous assumption simply because it's already stating what's in the entities. So it's not adding any value to explaining the true reason why these two entities are related and that one must cause the other. The second type of mistake is avoiding assumptions or statements that suggest there are no other choices. And you can see there after the word because I've restated that there is no other choice. This again is an erroneous assumption. It adds no value to greater understanding as to why the cause and effect relationship exists. The third one is avoid justifying one entity or another and ignoring the relationship itself. So again, my statement after the because, using the same A and B entities in the evaporating cloud, I've stated because a successful marketing campaign will make the property well known to potential customers. This is explaining the value of the successful marketing campaign, but it's not explaining the relationship between the successful marketing campaign and the return to house owner, and therefore is again an example of an erroneous assumption. The fourth type of error is when the assumption seeks to explain the next logical sequence in the cause and effect relationship. So as I stated earlier, you can have a cause giving rise to an effect. That effect then becomes a cause in its own right that gives rise to another effect. So here the example I give is in order to maximise returns to the house owner, I must conduct a successful marketing campaign because successful marketing campaigns cause competition in the marketplace. So whilst that statement is true, it's actually going beyond the relationship between these two entity statements and therefore is erroneous for that reason. The next item on the checklist is avoiding irrelevant or obvious statements. So the example that I give here in item 5 is because I can't imagine selling the house by any other process. This assumption is tenuous at best. It's certainly irrelevant and doesn't help explain why the relationship between maximising return to house owner and conducting a successful marketing campaign has been relied upon. So again, an example of an erroneous assumption. The next two that I talk about are give examples of in fact valid assumptions, because that's the easiest way of explaining these. And the first one is failing to identify the third factor. Now the third factor is in fact something that causes these two entities to exist currently together or causes that relationship to exist. And so the example I give here is because again using A, maximising returns to the house owner, and B, conducting a successful marketing campaign, A must, in order to maximise the returns, I must conduct the campaign because successful marketing campaigns can create a perception of scarcity, placing upward pressure on prices. So that upward pressure on price obviously gives rise eventually to improved or maximising returns to the house owner, and so therefore the third element that was missing was the perception of scarcity, and so this is an example of a valid assumption that seeks to address that. And the final one, item 7, is when we overlook the current mechanism that connects the two entities. So again, using the A and B entities, my because is because marketing campaigns inform prospective buyers that the owner's house is for sale. So that's the current mechanism that the marketing campaign uses to inform the market that the owner's house is indeed for sale, and therefore this is an example of a valid assumption. So when we move on to exposing the assumptions for the relationship between D and D prime, which is the conflict, there are three. The first one is to try and expose what's missing. And so what's being proposed here is what's missing could be guidelines or information or a method or trust between one or two entities, or indeed cooperation. So the example that I give here, which would be a valid assumption, is that there is currently no standard in place that defines who should fund what from a real estate marketing perspective. So that's indeed true in where I live, and it helps to explain the assumption as to why D and D prime are in conflict. The second one is to surface the conflict. So in this particular case, I'm using the because as not having the owner fund the marketing cost means that the owner believes that there is little or no downside to an agent-funded marketing campaign. So the reason why the owner would take a view that the agent must pay the marketing costs is because he believes that by enforcing that onto an agent, that there's no downside associated with that, or the cost of doing so is less than the benefits gained from taking that approach. So this assumption that the owner believes there is little or no downside to an agent-funded marketing campaign is an example of a valid assumption where it's seeking to surface the conflict. And finally, stating the obvious. So in this one, we've seen this before when trying to expose assumptions for the A, B, B, C, etc. relationships. This one also is valid for, or is a concern for the conflict when exposing assumptions. When someone says because they cannot exist at the same time, this is an example of an erroneous assumption, because it's stating the obvious and it's not adding any value.